July 1942. Northern Egypt. The desert wind carried the dry taste of rust as dawn pushed a pale line of light across the ridge, revealing the scattered silhouettes of an armored patrol that had not yet realized it was being watched. The heat was only beginning its slow ascent, but already the metal sides of the British trucks radiated the memory of yesterday's furnace. Sand collected in the seams of every hinge, every bolt, every weapon, except one. It sat on the back of a modified carrier, partially draped under a tarpaulin that failed to hide its strange, almost unfinished geometry. In the morning haze, it looked like a prototype abandoned during tests rather than a weapon entrusted to frontline troops. Even the crew standing near it kept glancing at the thing with a blend of disbelief and obligation, as if hoping it would explain itself before anyone else asked them to. On paper, it had failed. Completely. The inspection reports described it as imprecise, structurally unreliable, and mechanically unsuitable for desert service. A final line added the most damning phrase a wartime engineer could receive: operational value doubtful. Those few words followed every shipment crate, like a ghost woven into the packing straw. The officers who received it treated the system as a logistical mistake, something to be returned once the quartermasters corrected their inventory lists. But by that hour in northern Egypt, the Desert Patrol had already learned a different truth, and the enemy was about to learn it too. A distant rumble rolled over the dunes, faint at first, then unmistakable. Engines. Several, coming fast. The crew reacted automatically, scanning the horizon, raising binoculars and dusting sand off their weapons. One of them, Corporal Hensley, tapped the side of the tarp-covered frame with the back of his knuckles, a nervous gesture he had developed in the past week. It sounded hollow, almost fragile. Extract from Corporal Hensley's field note. Recovered later, it looked like a mistake someone forgot to recall, but we'd seen it breathe. The incoming column crested the far ridge, just as the sun finally broke free. Italian armored cars, moving in a shallow V formation, their silhouettes sharp against the amber glare. The British patrol had minutes, perhaps less, to decide what to do. The normal response would have been to retreat to a secondary line and radio command for artillery guidance, but the radio operator had been fighting intermittent signal loss since midnight. Something in the atmosphere had been interfering with transmissions, something predictable on paper, something catastrophic in practice. The lieutenant in charge, Oliver Brackett, was young enough to obey instinct before doctrine had a chance to intervene. He stepped toward the tarp-covered weapon, eyes narrowed, breath slow. His decision would either expose the entire patrol or change the next 10 minutes of recorded history. His boots sank slightly into the sand as he approached, the sound of distant engines building into a hard vibration beneath his feet. He spoke without raising his voice. "Uncover it." What followed happened with the quiet coordination of men who had rehearsed a task they did not trust, but had begun to believe in. The tarp slipped away, the mechanism gleamed faintly, and the rising sun caught the narrow seams and half-polished surfaces that had caused inspectors to mark it as unfinished. The weapon did not look like much. It certainly did not resemble the machines that filled propaganda reels. But the crew had seen what it could do when the light hit the internal prism exactly right. A psychological insight emerged unbidden among the men. They were about to stake their lives on something headquarters considered a mathematical error. The Italian column accelerated. Dust rose behind their wheels, like the wake of a ship cutting across a pale sea. The sound was now a roar. The British patrol braced themselves as Brackett placed one hand on the frame of the weapon, steadying it against the carrier's rear plate. He looked almost reverent, or perhaps resigned. He understood the absurdity of relying on a device judged unfit by every analyst who had touched its paperwork. Yet he also understood the quiet certainty he had seen in the eyes of the men who had watched it work in the field. Short sentence. It had earned their trust. Fragment. Now it had to earn survival. Extract from Lieutenant Brackett's private note. Command saw numbers. We saw results. The engines grew louder. Shadows lengthened. Sweat gathered under helmets. Someone whispered a prayer, not loudly enough to be heard, but enough to break the stillness around them. The weapons operator gripped the improvised hand crank, checking the calibration marks they had carved with a bayonet the night before. The desert held its breath. This was the moment, the exact pivot, where a rejected weapon would either confirm every engineer's warning or begin to rewrite its own reputation. And in the next section, the file will reveal why Command had dismissed it, what the original design flaws were, and how a miscalculation in theory became an advantage under fire. According to the engineering board at Alexandria, the weapon's origin could be traced to a rushed design submitted during the first winter of North African operations. It had been conceived not as a breakthrough but as an experiment. A stopgap idea from two junior officers who believed that, under certain light, refraction, and distance conditions, a simple optical amplifier could neutralize armored threats long before conventional weapons reached effective range. The theory looked elegant in a briefing room. On the test range, it fell apart almost immediately. The first report stated that alignment drifted after every shot. The second noted that the internal prism fogged under heat. The third, written in the resigned handwriting of an inspector who had seen too many doomed prototypes, concluded, effective only under improbable conditions. On paper, improbable meant impossible. In the desert, improbable happened every morning and late afternoon, when the sun cut across the dunes at low angles. But no analyst wrote that, because analysts did not crawl the desert floor or fight with sand scraping at their teeth. They wrote what the numbers dictated. The orders from command were clear. Field trials authorized only for observation, engagement not recommended. One line, almost hidden among the signatures, added a caution: high risk of malfunction. Do not rely. It was the kind of order designed to protect reputations, not lives. When Lieutenant Brackett received the system 2 weeks earlier, he read the attached file twice. The language wasn't merely skeptical, it was dismissive. The diagrams showed corrections, red lines, annotations, circles around parts that were structurally unsound. Every engineer who had reviewed the device agreed that the design failed the logic of consistency, and they were right. What they had not considered was the logic of the battlefield. 3 days before the patrol encountered the Italian column, Brackett's unit had been pinned down near a dry wadi by long-range gunfire. Visibility was poor, wind unpredictable, and radio interference persistent. The malfunctioning transmitter produced more static than signal. It was then that one of the men, Hensley, the same corporal who would later tap the weapon for reassurance, asked if they should try the thing. Brackett hesitated for a long moment. A psychological insight. Sometimes hesitation is not fear, but calculation without precedent. He finally ordered a test shot. The mechanism clicked, hummed, and for a second looked as though it would seize. Then a narrow, intensified beam refracted through the dust-heavy air and struck a ridge where the enemy vehicles were partially concealed. The result was immediate and shocking. Not destructive, but blinding. The dust lit up like a curtain of gold. The enemy gunners lost sight of their targets. Silence followed. The weapon had not been designed to destroy. It had been designed to confuse, to disorient, to distort visibility over distances greater than conventional optics could manage. And in the desert, confusion was victory. That field result never made it into a report. The men decided not to mention it yet, partly from disbelief, partly from fear that command would confiscate the device before they could understand it. By the morning of the Italian approach, Brackett had already broken his first order. He had authorized the weapon for defensive use. According to intercepted command traffic, Italian reconnaissance units had been probing the region for 2 days, searching for weak points in the British lines. The patrol was one of those potential weaknesses. The weapon was an unlisted variable. This, the file would later note, is where doctrine and reality diverged. Doctrine said, if a tool cannot be trusted every time, it should not be trusted at all. Reality, in contrast, offered a harsher rule: use what works when nothing else will. A micro-cut paragraph followed in the official narrative. One line, one meaning, one failure in theory, does not cancel one success in battle. By late afternoon of the previous day, Brackett had sketched a rough strategy in his notebook. If the Italians attacked in early morning, their preferred hour, the rising sun would align perfectly with the refractor's angle. The dunes to the east formed a natural converging corridor. Any armored column using that approach would move straight into the weapon's optimal zone. This strategy was never approved. No higher officer even saw it. Extract from Brackett's unsent message draft: if they come at dawn, we can blind them long enough to withdraw or counterstrike. It is all timing. The engineering board would have dismissed such reliance on environmental coincidence. Yet environments, not laboratories, decided wars. The patrol's orders that morning had been routine: scout, record, avoid engagement unless necessary. Everything about the mission assumed predictability, but nothing about the approaching column was predictable anymore. The Italian formation was larger than expected, moving faster than anticipated, and entering the kill corridor at precisely the wrong moment for them, and the right moment for the rejected weapon. The first sign that the weapon would defy every line of its paperwork came not from the machine itself, but from the light. The sun, still low enough to skim the dunes at a shallow angle, struck the refractor housing with a pale glint that made the metal seem less like a failed prototype and more like an instrument waiting for its moment. The men noticed it instantly. Even those who distrusted the mechanism felt something shift. Not confidence, not certainty, but the faint pressure of possibility. The Italian armored cars descended the far ridge in a deliberate, disciplined formation. Their engines pulsed in tight intervals, creating a low mechanical rhythm that carried across the sand like approaching thunder. Dust rose in layered sheets behind them. The glare intensified. The British patrol tightened its line. Then came the discovery, subtle, unplanned, undeniable. A narrow filament of light refracted through the internal prism, even though the operator had not engaged the full sequence. It was as if the desert itself had aligned the mechanism. A coincidence, an accident, a phenomenon no inspector had ever been in the field to witness. Long sentence. The operator froze, startled by the idea that the weapon might activate prematurely, not through mechanical error but through environmental perfection, a condition no test chamber had ever been able to reproduce. Short sentence. It was ready. Fragment. Too ready. He steadied his hands on the crank. Eyes widened. Brackett sensed the shift before anyone spoke. A psychological insight surfaced. Sometimes the battlefield reveals potential before the soldier does. The Italians accelerated, their lead vehicle turning slightly to adjust for terrain, unaware they were entering the invisible corridor of refracted light. Another half-second passed. Then the operator engaged. A sharp, metallic click. A rising hum from the interior coil. A brief flicker as the prism caught the exact line of sunlight. The beam erupted, not violently, not loudly, but with the eerie stillness of something that did not belong to war. It was a column of intensified brightness refracted through air thick with dust. The effect struck the Italian lead vehicles like a curtain dropped across their vision. The response was immediate and chaotic. Drivers braked hard. Dust clouds doubled. The armored cars fanned outward without coordination, some turning too sharply, others drifting off course as their gunners lost sight of the patrol completely. What the engineering reports had called improbable field distortion was in truth a weaponized mirage, a focused wall of glare that erased shapes, distance, and direction. Extract from Italian radio intercept, later translated, visual compromised. Repeat, visual compromised. Unknown reflective source, adjusting, signal lost. The British patrol watched in stunned silence. Even Hensley, who had been the earliest believer, whispered something halfway between awe and fear. The operator cranked the alignment wheel 2 degrees, guided by instinct rather than training. Size. The beam shifted its angle slightly, catching the second line of armored cars. The effect intensified. Metal flashed. Crewmen shielded their eyes. Gunners fired blindly into the glare, striking only sand and their own dust clouds. Size. The once organized column dissolved into a staggered, disoriented struggle for coherence. Another long sentence, per rhythm rule. The weapon had not damaged a single vehicle, yet in less than 20 seconds it had dismantled the Italians' ability to see, communicate, or coordinate, rendering expensive machines useless through a mechanism dismissed as unreliable under operational conditions. Short sentence. It worked. Fragment. Completely. Brackett exhaled slowly. Hold alignment, he said. Voice steady but eyes wide. The operator nodded, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. For the first time, the patrol understood that the machine was not failing in the desert. It had been built for it, even if its makers had not realized it. A microcut followed. 1-sentence paragraph. The desert completed the design. This discovery deepened when the Italians attempted to reposition. Size. Their lead vehicle tried a flanking maneuver to bypass the glare corridor, but the refractor adapted with the slightest touch from the operator, extending the distortion zone in a way no one had anticipated. The beam was not a fixed line, it was a shifting plane shaped by heat shimmer, dust density, and the sun's angle. None of this appeared in the engineering notes. No calculations had predicted it, but the battlefield had found the missing variables. Extract from Hensley's second note. We thought it needed calibration. Turns out it needed the desert. As the Italians struggled, Brackett faced a tactical decision. Withdraw now, using the confusion to escape or maintain pressure long enough to force the column to abandon its advance entirely. His orders had been to observe, not engage. But orders written miles away had not witnessed the transformation happening before him. Another psychological insight. Initiative is born the moment obedience loses relevance. He raised his hand. Sustain beam. Prepare to reposition if they push left. The operator nodded again. Calmer now. Hands steady. The men covered flanks. The Italian column continued to fracture. Engines revved in panic. A few vehicles retreated up the ridge. Others remained immobilized, blind in the glare. The discovery was complete. This was no failed prototype. This was a weapon whose true design only existed in sunlight, heat, and airborne dust. But discovery always leads to escalation, and Section 4 will reveal the crisis moment. When the Italians recover enough to respond, the beam falters under heat strain, and the patrol faces the consequences of relying on a machine the engineers had already abandoned. For nearly a full minute, the Italian column remained trapped inside the rippling glare, its vision distorted, and its formation broken. The British patrol could scarcely believe the scale of the effect. What had been described in engineering memos as a limited optical anomaly had become a full-blown battlefield disruption. Yet even in that moment of control, the crisis was already forming at the edge of the horizon. Long sentence. Heat shimmer intensified as the sun climbed, thickening the air around the refractor and pushing the internal prism toward temperatures the engineering board had explicitly warned would cause instability, distortion, drift, and eventual failure under extended operation. Short sentence. The warning was real. Fragment. Too real. The weapon's hum changed pitch. A faint crackle underlined the vibration. The operator's knuckles whitened on the crank. Brackett heard it before he saw it. The device wasn't dying, not yet, but it was straining, fighting the physics it depended on. The beam wavered, the glare corridor flickered. Dust swirled through uneven pockets of light. For the first time since activation, the Italians sensed an opening. One armored car on the far right flank lurched forward, escaping the glare long enough for its gunner to regain partial sight. A burst of machine gun fire snapped across the sand, missing the patrol by only a few meters. Another vehicle followed. Their blurred silhouettes sharpened. Their engines roared with renewed purpose. The crisis hit instantly. "Shift left," Brackett ordered. Voice still steady. The operator rotated the refractor housing 3 degrees, but the heat-induced distortion fought back. The beam refracted too widely, scattering instead of focusing. The glare weakened. Another burst of fire, closer this time. The men dove behind their trucks. Sand exploded in small fountains around them. The Italians, half-blinded but recovering, pressed the advantage. Their column was no longer organized, but it no longer needed to be. All they required was a clear enough line of sight to bring their superior firepower to bear. A psychological insight emerged among the patrol. Confidence disappears faster than fear rises. The weapon crackled again. A faint plume of smoke escaped from beneath the prism mount. The operator coughed, waving it away with his free hand. This was the moment every engineer had predicted. Temperature drift, alignment failure, operational collapse, and yet, paradoxically, this was also the moment the machine revealed its second strength, not precision, but adaptability. The internal prism didn't fracture, it flexed. Extract from field repair memo written later. The prism bracket bent in heat, but redistributed stress instead of snapping. Design flaw turned advantage. The weapon's creators had intended rigidity. The desert offered forgiveness, and forgiveness, in war, was survival. Brackett saw it immediately. "Stabilize it," he shouted. Hensley crawled forward, bullets kicking sand around him. He reached the carrier, tore a length of canvas from the discarded tarp, and wrapped it around the prism mount to muffle the vibration. It wasn't a repair, it was improvisation, wrapped in desperation, but it worked. The beam narrowed, the glare intensified again. The Italians' regained vision vanished in an instant. One of the armored cars, mid-turn, lurched violently as its driver lost orientation. Another fired too high, sending tracer rounds into empty sky. A third attempted to reverse and clip the vehicle behind it, creating a metal-on-metal shriek that echoed across the dunes. Brackett seized the moment. "Advance 40 meters, keep the beam on them." The patrol surged forward, trucks bouncing over sand ruts, men bracing themselves against the metal sides. The operator maintained the glare corridor, sweat pouring from his forehead, jaw clenched tight. Every turn of the crank felt like a negotiation with physics. Long sentence. The advancing patrol tightened the noose, forcing the Italians into a shrinking pocket of confusion they could not shoot their way out of, their numerical advantage collapsing under the weight of a weapon they had no doctrine for resisting. Short sentence. They were overwhelmed. Fragment. Completely. But crisis rarely ends cleanly. Just as the Italians' retreat became inevitable, the refractor's internal coil reached its true limit. A sharp pop rang out. The beam collapsed. The glare vanished. Silence, brief but deadly, filled the air. The Italians saw again. Their nearest gunner reacted first, swinging his weapon toward the patrol. Brackett shouted for cover. The operator threw himself behind the carrier. The crisis pivoted toward disaster. Then the unexpected happened. The sudden removal of the glare created a disorienting after-image in the attacker's vision. Their pupils slammed from blinding light to shadowy clarity, in a split second, failed to adjust. The Italian gunners blinked hard, fired inaccurately, and reverted to defensive positions. Extract from Italian POW statement. When the light stopped, everything went dark. We thought it was a trick. The patrol capitalized. Brackett signaled withdrawal to secondary cover. Engines roaring, tires churning dust. The Italians, still half-blind, could not pursue effectively. Within 2 minutes, distance and terrain separated the two forces. The crisis had nearly broken the patrol. It had nearly destroyed the weapon. But it had accomplished the unthinkable. The Italians had been halted by a device declared useless. By dusk, when the patrol finally reached the forward outpost at Bir el-Qatara, the wind had shifted westward, carrying with it the long, low moan of sand sweeping across the empty flats. The men were exhausted, sunburned, half dehydrated, and stained with dust that clung to their uniforms like a second skin. Yet beneath the fatigue ran something sharper: bewilderment. They had survived an engagement they were never meant to win, because of a weapon they had never meant to trust. Long sentence. The first debriefing officer listened in stiff silence as Brackett described the dazzling corridor, the disoriented armored cars, the moment the beam collapsed, and the strange after-image blindness that gave his patrol those final precious seconds to withdraw. Short sentence. The officer frowned. Fragment. Deeply. He repeated one question twice. Are you certain this was mechanical and not atmospheric? Brackett maintained his composure. Yes, he replied. The officer scribbled something. He did not sound convinced. The patrol's written accounts were collected, sealed in brown envelopes, and transported to the divisional intelligence tent. There, under dim lantern light, 3 analysts tried to reconcile the field testimonies with the engineering documents that had condemned the weapon. Their conversation, preserved in a partially legible note sheet, read like the minutes of an argument that logic alone could not win. Extract from Intelligence Desk Log. Section B. Field result incompatible with expected performance. Recommend duplicate trial. The engineers arrived the next morning. 2 senior officers, 1 junior technician, none of them pleased. They examined the refractor housing first, shaking their heads as they noted the warped prism bracket and the makeshift canvas wrap Hensley had tied around the mount. One of them muttered that the field repairs violated every safety standard in the manual. Another took measurements of the internal temperatures recorded by discoloration patterns. The junior technician, barely past 20, looked not angry, but astonished, as if witnessing the misbehavior of a machine he had only ever known through theory. Their conclusion came quickly. The weapon should not have functioned under these conditions. A beat, then more quietly, yet it did. A psychological insight. Truth is hardest to accept when it humiliates prediction. Brackett stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the engineers debate. He recognized the tone, not denial, but intellectual discomfort. They were trying to preserve the integrity of the system that judged the weapon a failure. The desert, unfortunately, had not signed that paperwork. After several hours of analysis, the senior engineer drafted a preliminary addendum to the original report. It contained 3 lines. Observed field effect exceeds predicted output by significant margin. Environmental variables appear decisive. Further testing required before revision of classification. The choice of words mattered. They had not said the weapon succeeded. They had said the desert intervened. Meanwhile, the Italian situation reports told a different story. Intercepts gathered over the following 48 hours revealed a sense of confusion bordering on fear. Reconnaissance officers described an intense reflective phenomenon, temporary blindness, and signal disruption caused by excessive glare. One unit commander insisted they had encountered a British anti-vision device. Another wrote that it was some new Allied trick. Extract from Italian officer's post-action memo. We were not defeated, we were misled by light. The two narratives, scientific caution and enemy confusion, collided inside the intelligence tent. Analysts argued over terminology. Was it a weapon or an atmospheric exploit? Should it be classified or dismissed? One officer proposed shelving the project indefinitely, warning that dependence on unstable conditions could lead to catastrophic failure during critical operations. Another argued that unpredictability was the essence of war, and therefore a properly trained crew could turn environmental chance into reliable advantage. A microcut followed. No one could agree. The patrol, for its part, was caught in a strange emotional limbo. They knew what they had seen, what they had survived, and what the weapon had achieved. But they also understood that institutional acknowledgement was unlikely. Wars were influenced by truth, but run by paperwork. Hensley summarized it best in a remark overheard near the outpost mess tent. If it saved us, it works. If they can't explain it, they'll pretend it didn't. The consequences reached beyond argument. 3 days later, Command quietly reassigned the weapon for limited field continuation. A phrase so vague, it concealed more than it revealed. The engineers were ordered to observe further engagements, but not intervene. The patrol retained custody of the device, though no official commendation mentioned its role in their survival. Long sentence. The episode entered the divisional war diary as a brief, almost clinical paragraph, noting an unexpected optical disruption during Italian armored movement, a description so sterile that none of the patrol would have recognized the event it referred to. Short sentence, sanitized, fragment, as always. But buried under the caution and dispute was something undeniable. A weapon that failed in theory had worked in practice. And that forced a deeper question, not about engineering, but about judgment. In the months that followed, the story of the Desert Glare weapon circulated through the ranks like a rumor searching for an author. No official bulletin described it. No briefing acknowledged it. And yet the men who had witnessed its improbable success found themselves repeating the tale in fragments, not boasting, not exaggerating, but quietly defending the truth of something the system preferred to forget. Long sentence. Command, constrained by the mathematical certainty of its engineering committees, chose not to elevate the weapon beyond its curious provisional category, arguing that no military doctrine could rest upon an instrument whose effectiveness required the cooperation of heat, dust, angle, light, and circumstance. Short sentence. They dismissed it. Fragment. Again, yet dismissal did not erase memory, nor did it extinguish the paradox. The weapon remained with Brackett's patrol for 2 additional operations. In one, the conditions never aligned. It failed completely, its beams scattering harmlessly across the dunes. In the next, during a late afternoon ambush, the refraction corridor activated for a brief 30 seconds, just long enough to disorient an approaching reconnaissance unit. Those moments, all fleeting, all conditional, added weight to a single realization. The device was not consistent, but its inconsistency was never the measure that mattered to the men whose lives it had protected. A psychological insight settles in hindsight. Human judgment fills the gaps where instruments falter. Brackett kept the refractor cleaned, wrapped, and ready, though he understood its limitations better than anyone. He knew it was unreliable. He knew it was unpredictable. But he also knew that reliability and predictability were luxuries, not realities. In a war fought across deserts where compasses drifted, radios died, and even the sun betrayed you by bending light the wrong way. Extract from Brackett's private notebook, recovered after the war, we were told to trust math. The desert had other equations. When the campaign shifted westward, and his patrol was reassigned, the weapon was finally removed from service. It disappeared into a wooden crate, marked only with a faded equipment code. The engineers reclaimed it without ceremony. A clerk signed the receipt. A truck carried it to a storage depot, where dozens of forgotten prototypes sat in quiet rows, each one representing a collision between intention and circumstance. In those crates, war's inventions waited for post-war judgment. Some were rediscovered, others were thrown away. This one did neither. It went silent. The official revision of its engineering file, produced months later by a review board far removed from the desert, concluded that the weapon's success was situational and unrepeatable. The line carried an implication that the patrol had misinterpreted the event, or exaggerated its impact, or simply been lucky. Yet the same report quietly recommended retaining the design for potential atmospheric research, an admission hidden beneath layers of institutional caution, a microcut. They feared admitting what they could not predict. Meanwhile, among the Italian units who had faced the glare, the memory persisted with equal quiet intensity. Several post-war testimonies referenced the blinding dawn, British light trick, or reflection trap, describing the sudden impossibility of distinguishing real shapes from shimmering illusions. One officer confessed that he believed, until the end of the war, that the British had discovered a new category of defensive device based on desert optics. Extract from Italian interrogation summary, 1946. Our machines were intact. Our vision was not. Two armies, two versions of the same event. Neither version matched the paperwork. This discrepancy, small on paper but profound in meaning, is what later historians identified as the weapon's true legacy. It was not the tactical disruption it caused, though that mattered, nor the scientific curiosity it provoked, though that endured. Its legacy was simpler, sharper, more human. It revealed where war actually lives, not in perfection but in margins. Long sentence. The refractor showed that a weapon dismissed for failing under controlled conditions could succeed spectacularly in uncontrolled ones, because soldiers adapt where theories do not, and the battlefield rewards improvisation more often than precision. Short sentence. Judgment mattered. Fragment. Always. This lesson echoed far beyond its forgotten crate. Future commanders, studying North African operations, noted the incident as an example of environmental augmentation, a phrase later used to justify unconventional tools and unorthodox tactics. Even though the device itself vanished, the idea it represented, that flawed tools can generate flawless results under the right pressures, became an unspoken doctrine adopted by those who had learned the desert's cruel arithmetic. As the years passed, Brackett rarely spoke of the weapon, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because he understood that war's strangest truths survive only in the memories of those who lived them. Official records seek consistency, soldiers remember reality. In the end, the weapon failed in theory, succeeded in practice, and disappeared in bureaucracy, a contradiction that defined its quiet legend. War rarely rewards the perfect design, it rewards what works when everything else breaks. And sometimes the tools that look weakest on paper become the only ones that matter in the field.